Foundation. I think a few people are still joining, but if it's okay, as it is 11 a.m., we will kick off. Firstly, I want to acknowledge that we are joining you from Gadigal country here, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we meet and pay my respect to elders past, present, and any First Nation people and colleagues that we have on the call. And please, if you'd like to do so, please acknowledge where you are joining from in the chat function if you'd like to do so. It's always wonderful to see across this beautiful country where people are joining us from. This is the second webinar where we're talking about the open grant round on employment from Paul Ramsay Foundation. And it has been wonderful to see the engagement. Oh, and great to see people acknowledging where they're joining from. That is a wonderful thing. So what we'll do some quick introductions. Then I'll provide a quick overview of Paul Ramsay Foundations from those of you who do not know us already. Then my colleague Josie will talk through the overview of the Employment Open Grant Round, then what we're looking for. And then the essential thing and the point of this call is actually for us to be quiet, so to speak, and to hear questions from yourselves. So please do ask whatever questions that you have, and we will do our very, very best to answer those questions. I will encourage you all to ask those questions at the chat function. We do have quite a number of people on today. So if you could do us a favour and keep yourselves muted, unless you're desperate to get our attention, but please, if you could keep yourselves muted, that would be great. And we will endeavour to get through every single question that is asked. If we fail to do so, please follow up with an email and we will answer those questions. So yes, we want to address any issues, questions, concerns you might have.
Hi, can you hear us?
We can.
Oh, you can hear us, but we can't.
We can't hear you.
Yeah.
Blimey.
Yeah.
Have
Well,
I
I
just,
system.
well, you must have heard
Can you
something. Could I ask everyone to just, yes, mute would be wonderful.
My speaker is muted.
So people can hear us, so there may be some
There we go.
There we go.
individual issues.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think we have the capability to mute people.
Yeah,
That
I
doesn't
can
sound.
mute all, but you just might need to manually.
I think we're there on the technology.
Yeah, but we can hear you
So that
now.
is
We can hear
Good.
you. Excellent.
excellent. Well, I don't think you've missed much other than what I said was we'll do a quick introduction of ourselves, an overview of Paul Ramsay Foundation. Josie will talk through what we're looking for from the open grant round, and then we'll open ourselves up for any questions you have. And if there are any technical issues, we will start communicating through the chat function, but hopefully not. So my name is Ben Gales. I'm the Chief Delivery Officer here at Paul Ramsay Foundation, which means I look after the grant side of things. Josie?
And I'm Josie Khalil, and I look after the employment portfolio, our employment impact area.
So just a quick overview of Paul Ramsay Foundation. We were established by Paul Ramsay, who set up Paul Ramsay Healthcare. And when he passed away, he left a very generous and major bequest to the Paul Ramsay Foundation. And our aim and our mission is to help address cycles of disadvantage. What do we mean by that? Because we operate in a complex world, but there is a range of things we want to achieve and support our partners to achieve. And just to be clear, we don't do anything ourselves other than support partners. But we want to address those intergenerational cycles of disadvantage. And we have a number of focus areas, which is around early childhood, school-age learning, employment, justice and safety. And in particular, those first three, you can think of a kind of life course. So early childhood 0 to 5, school-age learning 5 to 16, and employment in that kind of 16, 18 to 30. So you'll understand from that we have a focus on youth. We are very keen in terms of disrupting cycles of disadvantage to try and engage in issues early in people's lives, but we are not, we don't lose sight of the intersectionality of issues and the complex world in which we operate, the complexity of us as human beings and people and individuals. So we're cognizant of the value of community, connection to land and community, the importance of the household, family, carers. And so we don't just focus on these very, specific childhood, education, jobs, justice. Those are just aspects, and we understand that the world is more complex than that. But that's Paul Ramsey Foundation. I will ask Josie just to talk through the employment aspect, and then we'll come back to what we're looking for.
Thanks, Ben. So just a quick summary. You might be wondering why those impact areas, why employment. So for us, we believe that all people and communities around Australia deserve the chance to thrive, and we see employment as one way for people to have economic dignity and social mobility, and that's why employment for us. Quality employment or self-employment for some people is about, employment that provides a decent wage, and we think that should be accessible to everyone. But we recognise that many people face systemic barriers, by which we mean the social and economic factors outside of their individual control that prevents them from entering the workforce, or they hold multiple low-paid, insecure jobs, which actually keeps them trapped in poverty. So as Ben said, we invest in organisations and initiatives and programs that try to reduce the systemic barriers to employment. And we're interested in both, addressing the immediate manifestations of employment, because we have a moral obligation, if nothing else, to do that. But also we are really interested in the deeper social and economic conditions that perpetuate unemployment and prevent social mobility. We also recognise there's a very clear intergenerational impact to unemployment. We know that kids that grow up in jobless and low-income households have a much higher probability of being out of the labour force themselves as adults, and that's that intergenerational focus that we have. And as Ben said, we also recognise that while we focus on employment, there is a broader context there. And we see employment as both potentially reducing, but also mitigating the probability of adverse life events, for example, contact with the justice system or a mental health episode. And we recognise that the employment system is actually quite intrinsically and fundamentally linked with other important systems in Australia, like the social security income support system. So just as a bit of context, we wanted to share a bit about how we see our role in the employment system and how we think about employment. And that's what you see on the slide here. So we pretty much look at employment with 4 key levers. One is supply, so we can invest in people to give them the best chance to thrive and make successful transitions. There's the lever around demand, so how can we create and increase the number of jobs that are available for cohorts that experience disadvantage and exclusion. And that includes social enterprise, mainstream employment, social procurement, and a whole raft of things. There's an important lever around linking supply and demand. And here we think about, strengthening the connection between specific cohorts and jobs, whether it's place-based, whether it's pathways. And quite importantly, the one at the bottom there around systems and policy settings. And this is around what are the things that need to change in the policy, economic and social system so we can have sustained impact and systemic change. For example, and that includes things like mainstream employment practices that tend to exclude people. So that's where we see our role. And to date, just to give you a sense, we've invested and partnered with organisations around advocating and piloting alternatives to the government-funded employment service system, whether it's CDP or Workforce Australia, TTW. We've also supported organisations that are delivering self-employment outcomes for our cohort and organisations reducing recidivism through employment. Our next big focus is around visibility in jobs and future jobs, as well as more work around that employment service ecosystem. So that's just a bit of background and context around where we see our role. In terms of what we're looking for with the open grant round, we place a high value on organisations that bring that lived expertise into and a commitment to the participation of people with lived expertise in designing and running the programs that they provide. But essentially, we're looking for innovative solutions or models to test, or tried and tested and scalable solutions across the dimensions. And how we've tried to present that in terms of the open grant round is kind of 3 buckets. One, innovative solutions. So you might have an idea or a model that you're testing at small scale, and you just need to build the evidence base around does it work for who in what context. That's our testing innovative solutions. The second bucket is around, you might have a program that's actually achieving quite good outcomes for our cohort and is ready to be scaled or replicated. We're really interested in supporting that. And thirdly, what we're calling our multidisciplinary approaches. to address the challenge for our cohorts. And here we're really trying to encourage and support by funding collaborations across sectors. So you might be, a for-profit company in the medtech space, for example, partnering with a charity to deliver outcomes for our cohort. So we want to try and encourage and fund that collaboration because we believe that that will lead to more innovative solutions and better outcomes. And I should say we're interested in the achievement of outcomes for our cohort, not on how you go about doing that. I might pause. Ben, do you want to talk about the system levels?
Yeah, all I would add, I think that's an excellent intro in terms of what we're looking for. What I'd say is we are also keen to operate at what we describe as different levels. We talk about systems change, and probably all of you will understand that better than I do. But we think about this at kind of 3 different levels. So one is, what are we doing to support people today who need that support, either to mitigate issues or to avoid issues, as Josie said earlier. We're also interested in driving improvements in the system. A number of that might be the employment system, it might be the situation in local communities, it might be some particular policy or welfare setting which we want to drive that shift, provide the evidence for why communities should adopt this, government should adopt these changes. And then finally, really reimagining the system. And one of the really nice things about operating within a foundation, I used to work, in fact, both of us used to work in government. I've also worked in the sector. One of the nice things about working in the foundation, we can take a kind of long-term view. So when we think about what does good really look like, we can take a long-term perspective on what that might look like. So really keen to look at those levels. So that's, yes, all I would add.
And just want to reiterate, we have a very clear target cohort focus. We're looking for outcomes for young people, 15 to 24, roughly speaking, who are at risk or are not engaged in education, employment and training. And again, it's because we see this as a really pivotal life transition point. We want to engage people early so they can thrive. And the second target cohort for our open grant round and our employment impact area are jobless families or households with children with no one is employed. And again, the reason for that is because of that intergenerational impact of unemployment that we're looking to try and disrupt. So that's, even though that's quite targeted at the very pointy end of disadvantage, that'll include a range of different groups. And we've put a few in the guidelines. You might be First Nations communities, you might be people living with a disability, refugees, people seeking asylum. There are a lot of groups of people in our community that face these systemic barriers.
So with that, what I'll say is that, firstly, a huge thank you to all of you for your engagement and your time. We do understand this is an investment in time from yourselves. It's hugely appreciated. And we will pause at this moment. If you have questions, please put them in the chat function. And for whatever remainder of the time we need, we'll do our best to answer those questions and come back to you. So my colleagues are going to summarize some of the questions we're getting through.
We did receive a few prior to the webinar, so thank you for those who submitted them. So you might cover off on those while you have a chance to write your questions. So we had a question around, is this a pure grants round or would you also be open to blended capital models? Very much open. So yes, the focus is grants, but obviously we work very closely with our impact investing colleagues. So if you have an idea that's more of a mix of capital, very welcome to submit that. There was another question prior to the event around, do you need DGR or PBI status to receive the grant? So we do have the guidelines around the entity. You do not require DGR status, but yes, PBI status is good. So we're looking for organisations who are registered with the ACNC as registered charities or mission aligned.
There are a couple of questions that I've seen come through around time horizons and grants. Obviously, it's not, we're not saying these are 1, 2 or 3 year grants, and we want the grant horizon to be the appropriate amount. All I'll do is that usual caveat is what we are keen to do is work with our partners to learn by doing, and you might do a smaller initial grant and then scale when you're confident that it's working as expected. But we don't have any hard and fast perspectives on the time horizons of the grants.
Likewise, there's a question around the quantum of funding. So our envelope for the grant round is around $12.5 million. We're looking to have national reach in terms of geography. So we haven't actually specified a specific upper or lower limit because it really does depend on what you're putting forward. But just to give you a sense, we're looking for national reach and our envelope overall is around $12.5 million.
And we can help shape with our partners coming through in terms of what is the appropriate funding envelope. And the reason why we don't want to stifle ambition by setting an upper, we might just shape it appropriately. And as Josie said, it's 12.5 million is our kind of indicative bucket, and that is to support multiple organisations across Australia. So you get an idea from that. And there are some questions around coaching and mentoring. I think that's a really, really good point. I think and we are doing a couple of approaches where we're providing that support to partners or prospective partners to help shape proposals and shape the programs. So I'm not going to make any guarantees, but there are those opportunities as well. And we certainly understand that we need to be, as a foundation, investing in the sector capability, not simply about how you deliver those outcomes, but also in the organisations and the sector.
There's a question there around the definition of at risk. So would it include young people playing a significant caring role in single parent jobless households? So we're not hard and fast on the definition. I think young people who are doing a caring role and even support their family, absolutely, very much in scope.
There are some really interesting questions about how specific this needs to be around employment. I think it's a fantastic question because I don't want to fudge the answer, but I will do my best at answering it. We want those employment outcomes, but we also recognise that human beings are complex. And the getting of a job, retaining a job, getting a good quality job may be the final 5% of someone's pathway into that job. And we want to recognise, we want to fund the 95% as well as the 5%. So it's absolutely that pathway into employment. And so you might have an organisation where within your constitution, your charitable purpose might be, and please don't just come back with housing solutions if I say housing solutions for at-risk youth, or addressing people's mental health issues, and you're not mentioning employment at all. But actually employment is the end goal of what we're seeking, but what you're providing unlocks that employment opportunity. So please don't be put off if you don't have a very direct employment focus as an organisation. We absolutely recognise the complexity of us as human beings and the issues that we're grappling with here for people who have been disenfranchised, underserved, or may have experienced particular events in their lives, which means they can't just go and get a job.
There's a question around considering, I don't know if you answered this, Ben, funding evaluation of existing programs that are place-based specific. Did you answer that?
No, but.
So, I mean, yes, as long as it's our target cohort and it's around the employment outcomes are a key part of that, then yes, definitely open to that.
And we are really keen just to amplify that and be aware of this. We see this as very much a learning, and just to be clear, not for Paul Ramsey Foundation, but for the sector and for the community. That learning aspect is super, super important. So evaluation of what we do and being able to share that and the opportunity to peer learning is super important to us. I think there was a comment just about how there was a similarity to facts pathways. Yes, we're not inventing any wheels here. Where there's a lovely phrase, standing on the shoulders of giants. We're building on a huge amount of wealth and knowledge that already exists, and I'm pretty sure amongst the over 100 people that we've got online here, you have that wealth and knowledge, and yes, we're building on that, and we want to support you.
How important is it that proposals incorporate opportunities for system and policy change? So we are very interested in system change. If your program is targeted at a specific community, that's also fine. I think, as Ben said, it's both. It's supporting people and who are needing that support now, as well as the system change. So it's fine if you don't do both.
And now I've seen the second half of the question about the DCJ opportunities pathways. I actually didn't know it stopped. I'm familiar with the program, but the fact that this might sound a bit like that is pure coincidence. It's not our job to do the work of government. absolutely not. We see ourselves as at the more kind of, for want of a better phrase, risk capital innovation. We're not there to pick up what the government should be doing. But we recognise that the government doesn't always want to take risks, support organisations, and at the different levels of government, you can have that disconnect. So no, pure coincidence if it sounded too much like the Opportunity Pathways programme.
Do you want to take the question on outcomes? So what kind of outcomes are you looking to measure? Is it specifically X amount of people in employment pathways? That's a great question.
Yeah, ultimately that outcome of economic dignity is what we want to achieve. We'll work with our partners as to what the right outcome measures are. So it may be that there is an interim outcome which is just as important or even more important than the employment outcome. And for a certain cohort of that group, yes, employment is the outcome, but there may be an intermediate outcome which is just as important. So you think, and there are various, outcome frameworks. You've got the RAC Nest framework. You've got the Human Services Outcomes framework. In fact, I think pick up any rock in government, you'll find an outcomes framework. We operate in a similar understanding of that complexity, and we'll work with our partners in terms of understanding what are the right outcomes to measure. But just to be clear, our focus here is unlocking that economic dignity, job, employment outcomes. But we recognise there are many, many interim steps on that way. So there was a question earlier from an organisation around that kind of at the more education focused side of things in terms of that pathway for young people to get them employment ready that might be 2 or 3 years down the road. That would be an example of where there are interim outcomes. It's not a job, but there are interim outcomes which unlock it in later life. So yes, we would look at those types of opportunities as well.
There's a question on how many programs we're looking to accept or carried out. So and we didn't really talk about the process of the open grant round, which maybe we should have done, but it's quite detailed in the guidelines. So the expression of interest period is for 4 weeks. And so if you're unsure if your program is a fit, because there are some questions there, I'm happy to book in a 15-minute scoping call and we can chat through your specific proposal. After that period, we'll shortlist the applications against that criteria and then invite people to come back and submit a full application, which is a bit more involved. So, I mean, we don't have a hard and fast number. It just depends on what comes through and our budget of about $12.5 million. There is also a question in here, just to clarify, around programs with a national reach, or can they be state-based programs? Absolutely. So we're looking to have national reach, which we can do through multiple partners. We're not asking one organisation to have national reach.
And there's also a question around place-based, or as well as community of practice, multi-jurisdictional, collaboration. We love all those aspects in terms of, it may be there is one organisation out there that can solve issues, and I'd love to find them. But normally, it takes the proverbial village. So collaboration is super, super welcome. As part of this program, we've been toying with that, and we're really keen to understand actually what prospective partners want in terms of a community practice, that peer learning. We think that is super interesting. Again, just to emphasize, the learning that I talk about here is we want to support community learning and sector learning. So we're super interested in those communities of practice and how we might be able to support those.
There's a question on would we consider programs for refugee households who may be holding work, but precarious work that traps families in poverty? Absolutely. So refugees, people seeking asylum are definitely in scope, because it's about like a sustainable impact, a sustainable outcome. And we recognise that people in precarious positions that might not even be matched to their skill level is never going to help someone break out of poverty. So absolutely, yes.
There's a question around the applicability for social enterprises and WISEs. Absolutely. It's set out in the guidelines as to how we can work with social enterprises. Don't be put off by kind of DGR status if that's the issue around social enterprise. We're super interested, and we have historically supported the sector. So yes, we welcome proposals from social enterprises as well, absolutely. There's also a question, so there's a domestic family violence grant round that ACF is operating in partnership with Paul Ramsey Foundation. Don't be put off by applying for both, other than my only plea to yourselves is we really understand the investment of time and effort that it takes in applying for these grant rounds. So I don't want to put you off in any way, shape or form. There's no preference or not if you apply for both or just one. I'm involved in both, but we are sensitive to how long it takes to apply for these things. But if you think there's angles in both camps, there's absolutely no harm whatsoever in applying for both.
There's a question around, do you fund elements of BAU if our program is meeting your specification with portions going towards scale? Yes, if you're working with our cohort, very interested to think about how we support you and particularly around that scale component.
So it's a very interesting question around First Nations and again, secondary students, links into out of home care. You'll have seen what we've talked about. We talked a bit about cohorts, but not a huge amount around cohorts. But support for, First Nations, people living in rural, remote communities, people living with disability, kids in out of home care. We look across many of the areas that we're really interested in, some of those drivers and manifestations of intergenerational disadvantage. And those are all people that just, if we can help unlock outcomes from them, absolutely. Just to reiterate, if this is at an earlier phase in their lives, so Josie talks about kind of 15 to 24, nothing's hard and fast here, but if it's earlier and they're still in school, but we want to support them in order to, at a later time, achieve those employment outcomes, absolutely, we will look at that. There's a quite a specific question around, and I apologize because I feel as though I'm repeating myself a little bit, but just questions about social enterprise coming through, benefits specific cohorts, young people living with disabilities. Absolutely. Yes, that's kind of very, very much within scope of what we're looking to support. But I probably should have said as well, on the last webinar, I think we ran out of steam after about 25 minutes. I just emphasize again what I said at the beginning. If you think, oh God, I wish I'd asked that question, tonight or tomorrow, just follow up with an email and we'll respond. You don't need to ask all the questions today. There are a few more coming through though.
Yeah, there's one around, if a local government is auspicing funds for an Aboriginal corporation, can they apply? So yes, but I think it's the Aboriginal corporation that would need to be the key agency applying, because we don't tend to fund a local government, although is that right?
Yeah, we don't like funding government. Sorry, I don't mean that disrespectfully. I've spent a third of my career working in government, but government can fund themselves. Yes, so yes, but getting that, we understand the challenges for many, in particular small organisations, who are so often excluded from grant rounds because they might not have DGR. So whether that's done through auspicing or just come to us and we'll see what we can work through. Don't be put off if you don't have DGR. Having set up a organisation myself and a charity myself, and we got PBI status, but I know what it cost us to pay the lawyers to get that through. Not everyone has those resources, so please don't be put off by that. So yes, auspicing, or even if we can support you without DGR, don't be put off by that aspect.
So there's a question on our target cohort. Does this include employment pathways for adults, i.e. single parent households where there are young people in the household? Is it only focused on employment pathways for young people? Absolutely, it's the parents in those jobless households, because we recognise the impact for the young people that are growing up in that low income household. So yes, want to support the parents as well, especially the single parent families.
There's a question around feasibility studies on job opportunities within a social enterprise. My quick answer is obviously the devil's in the detail. My quick answer is absolutely yes. Always just remember that for Paul Ramsey Foundation, our focus is on public good and those outcomes that we're trying to achieve. It's not for private benefit. And by the way, I'm not conflating those things because it's a social enterprise. I'd say that just generally, and I've worked in the social enterprise space. I'm just saying that to be crystal clear that we're supporting public good, and those feasibility studies I think are excellent and really keen to look at what we could support that you otherwise wouldn't be able to get off the ground. I just want to be clear, it's got to be squarely within our charitable purposes.
There's a question around clarifying regarding young people with a disability, if there is an emphasis on young people not eligible for the NDIS or Tier 2 significant gap. So my quick response to that is we are not hard and fast around the criteria. It's very much, is it a young person with a disability? You know, obviously they have a lot of systemic barriers, and then if you are there other compounding disadvantage like growing up in a low-income household or rural regional setting? It's more that rather than eligibility for the NDIS that we would look at.
I also like the question just because when we talked about those different levels of impact that we want to achieve, you know, immediate support for beneficiaries, people who actually really need that support today, but also driving changes in the systems, the processes, the policies that are in place, as well as reimagining. But in that second one, you know, I'm a huge fan of NDIS, but I know that it's far from perfect, and there are some clunky aspects in there. You know, we do engage with our government colleagues. If we can put some evidence together to drive a much needed improvement in the way things are structured, that's a big win for us. So Josie answers these questions much better than me, but I really like that question around the NDIS and not to be too hard and fast on this, because if we can drive improvements, that is such a big win for everyone.
Yeah, and we talked before about the intersections with employment and like income support, for example, same thing with disability, DSP. So if there are things, for example, you know, like the DSP at a certain rate, it might discourage really talented people with a disability who are neurodiverse, for example, from, you know, taking on full-time work. Then if you have a, if you want to tackle that, or there are organisations out there that want to work on those systemic barriers, I'm very interested in that space as well.
There are some questions around the level of detail in the EOI and attachments of previous evaluation. I'm trying to remember whether you can add attachments.
No.
They can email.
Just email them through. Let me just, and sorry, I'll add that. The level of detail, we've designed the EOI to try and minimise the effort that has to go into applying for the open grant round. Having been involved, and both of us having been involved in several funding opportunities in the past, we are so acutely sensitive to the time and effort and investment that goes in to providing these applications. So you'll see that it's quite short. It is intentionally short. Please don't feel disadvantaged by the fact that it's intentionally short. We're trying to minimize your time and investment. And if something like an evaluation or further material you think is absolutely essential, then yes, send it through. My colleague has said, yes, we can take those. But we really are so sensitive to the time and effort that goes into these applications. There's an industry out there to do these applications. And actually, we want to make it as painless as possible. So yes, that's why the EOI is relatively short.
Yeah, so just to emphasise, if you do want to send anything additional, please do that via email. The EOI is quite short because as some of the questions alluded to, we're probably going to get a whole bunch more applications than we're able to fund. So we just want to, you know, make it really not waste your time and just give you a quick indication of does it kind of meet the guidelines and the things that we're looking for without making you invest a whole bunch of time.
Timeframes?
Timeframes, I think you kind of talked about that before. It depends on the project, but we don't have any predefined, you know. Is that a question around the multi-year grants, or is it a question around when funding will be available? I'll answer both just in case. So, you know, multi-year grants very much open to that. It really depends on what your proposal is. If it's a feasibility study, I don't see that being multi-year grant. If you're trying to pilot something, I do. Timeframes around money being available. So we were looking to have So EOI for 4 weeks, we'll have a couple of weeks to shortlist. We'll invite people to submit a full application. You have about 4 weeks to do that. We'll then need to take those to assess them and then take them through our approval process. So we're looking to get back to people with an answer on those full applications by about late May, early June. And after that point, it's just a matter of setting up a grant agreement, which shouldn't take too long. And then the funds will be released at that point. So I want to say July, but please don't hold me to that. We'll do our best to get the funds out as soon as possible.
There was a question about would we recommend a scoping call for a startup not-for-profit? Absolutely. So the scoping calls are part of our, and they're not essential, but they're part of our commitment to try and minimize how painful this is. So if you've got some quick questions around, is this applicable for me? We're a startup, we don't even exist yet, and we're just, scribble on a placemat. Whatever those kind of questions might be, just ask us. Because we want to make this as simple as possible, and we're absolutely fine. In fact, one of the absolute delights of the past week has been doing the scoping calls and just hearing about new organisations and what fantastic things are going on, which we're just not across. So actually, as well as we want to save you time, we quite enjoy the scoping calls.
Absolutely open to multi-year grants. I think it was Michelle who just posted that.
Infrastructure. I think this is the question around OPEX, CAPEX, where we just want to fund what will impact on those outcomes. So we're open to that. Whatever is the best way of achieving the outcomes, we'll look at. Obviously, capital infrastructure expenditure often has a larger price tag to it, but it is what it is. But yes, we're open to those.
And just to confirm, we'll definitely share with you the link to the webinar and the slides afterwards via email, and the FAQs will update to reflect what we've talked about today. So that's available to everyone.
So what we'll do is just, we'll hold this if there are any final burning questions in the next couple of minutes. As we said earlier, if you have further follow-up questions, just email them through. Absolutely book in a scoping call. And we just look forward to engaging with yourselves, working with yourselves. We learn a lot.
We do. It's fantastic. Sorry, one more thing. If you happen to not be able to book in a scoping call because they've been booked out, just shoot us an email at hello@paulramseyfoundation.org.au and we will find time to make that happen.
There are a couple of follow-on questions that I'll just quickly answer. A single organisation looking for funding across multiple areas, absolutely. Do you need to do it? I don't know if you've asked this question, but I'll ask it for you. Do you need to do it as a single EOI response or multiple EOI response? Whatever works for you. If you can cover it off in one, it'll probably save you time. But if you need to convey a bit more information across the different aspects, then please do so. I think we are talked out. But can I just say a huge thanks to yourselves. As I say, we recognise that this is an investment from yourselves, and it really is appreciated. Any further questions, just come back to us. We will be sharing the information from today's session. Look forward to chatting and engaging with many of you going forward. I think this will be fun.
And thanks for all the work you do supporting vulnerable people.
Thank you all. We will wrap up at that point.
Take care.